Welcome everybody back from your coffee break. We've talked a little bit about sort of some of the basics so far this morning, and now what I want to do is move a little bit deeper into how do you use this stuff and what is it good for, which is sort of fundamental once one gets through the basics. So my name is Kuhlman. I'm the CEO of a company called Monax. We're an Edinburgh headquartered company. We have about half the company here and about half the company in New York. We've been around for a wee while, as I like to say, now that I'm in my adopted country and I can say we. We're another way to say it when I'm not talking to Scottish people is we're a dinosaur in the blockchain world. We were the first to market with what Duncan was talking about in terms of permissioned blockchains. We were the first to market with scalable packages of smart contracts that could be used by enterprises to do various use cases. And we were the first to market this technology and really think of this technology as an enabler for legal, which is a term I've used for a very long time, even before we were particularly in the legal domain. I originally was using it to mean we're talking about legally compliant applications of blockchain technology. Now, when I say we do legal applications of blockchain, I mean the domain of legal. And all of these things that we have been working on over the course of the last 4 years all exist in various flavors of open source. And I liked a lot what Duncan was talking about. Our permissioned blockchain client has been contributed to the Hyperledger project under the Linux Foundation as one of the 5 frameworks that Duncan was talking about. It is known as Hyperledger Burrow now. It includes a permissioned Ethereum virtual machine, and proof-of-stake consensus layer made by a project called Tendermint. On top of that, we have sort of hardened and made much more sophisticated our packages of smart contracts and bundled them into a coherent project now, rather than a series of smaller projects, which is called Blackstone. And I'm going to be talking a little bit more about the benefits of using a framework like Blackstone here in a second. And then in terms of what we've been doing in the legal domain, we're working with a range of companies to build an open ecosystem called the Agreements Network, which is a contract lifecycle management solution that leverages blockchains to do something that we've never really been able to do in prior generations of technology, namely track where we are in the execution of legal contracts. But for the purposes of this talk, the rest of this talk, what I'd like to start on is talk about why it's important to consider sharing processes. And then I'm going to talk a little bit more about how to do that. So when we look across the landscape of blockchains for business and the use cases of blockchains for businesses, there's basically 3 paradigms. And pretty much every use case one can consider fits quite cleanly in one or more of these paradigms. Depending on the sophistication of the use case, maybe it fits a couple. Typically, it will be focused on, particularly in the early days of this technology, it'll be focused on one of these domains. The first is tokenize and trade. Tokenize and trade because the bankers, thanks RBS for hosting, the bankers have been on this technology from an enterprise perspective longer than other domains. And so a lot of the tokenize and trade use cases are a little bit further in their development than some of the other use cases, because mostly the tokenize and trade use cases are applicable to finance. The basic idea of these use cases is we need to reduce friction within a trading system. And so we're going to take an asset, digital asset, a physical asset, we're going to tokenize it somehow so that we can therefore trade it a little bit more effectively. The second paradigm that we see over and over and over again is what I would call a tag and track use case. And the tag and track use case is somewhat different, but and typically divergent from tokenize and trade use cases. Not always, but mostly. And in tag and track, what we try to do is tag a physical or digital good and then track it as it flows through a supply chain or an ecosystem. The basic idea here is proof over provenance. To know where something came from, to know the chain of title of that thing, to know what transformations happened to this thing as it went through a supply chain. These are all things that tag and track use cases are excellent at. And then finally, we have shared processes. And shared processes use cases are being explored heavily across a range of domains. They're a little bit harder to do because it's not quite so clean. It's very simple for me to say, oh, tokenize and trade, and a lot of people can quickly get that. Or I can say tag and track, and people can quite easily get that. But when you start thinking about shared process use cases, these become a little bit harder. But the basic idea is to take pieces of a processing pipeline or pieces of a business process pipeline, I should say, and move this into a shared space in order to reduce errors and reduce costs, typically. Now, historically, enterprises have relied heavily on business processes, and particularly business process modeling. And they do this so that they can visualize how a business process or flow is supposed to operate, and then use that visualization to automate pieces of it on the one hand, and then also as fodder to pay consultants or whatnot that might come in and say, here's how we can tweak these things to improve this business process. And it's kind of up in the air what improving that business process means. It would be very, very domain specific. But this idea of leveraging a flow charting system or a modeling system to outline, this is how we do this thing. That might be how we take an invoice in and turn that into money that goes out. It might be how we produce something. It might be how we design something. It might be how we take the fact that we shipped a couple of pallets of goods to somebody and we need to turn that into an invoice. These are all very typical business processes that will be modeled within companies, these in a graphical manner, and then used as fodder to improve how we can do this. And this discipline of business process modeling enables IT departments and business units to have a rational conversation about requirements, about needs, and about expectations on what I need to do on the business side or what I need to understand on the IT side in order to enable this business activity. And then the piece of business process modeling that is always a challenge is that this is a internal focused domain. So a single business's business processes will be understood and managed internal to that company's organization. And so what this leads to is to a situation where when you have sophisticated companies doing business with each other, you will have multiple business processes, because on either side of this relationship or transaction, whatever we want to call it, will be business processes. And the outputs of one business process will often trigger the beginning of a different process. There will be pieces in nearly every business process model that exists in the real world where you have a black box somewhere in this process where we have to step outside of the four walls of our enterprise and ask somebody else for some data, for an approval, or something along these lines. And this black box then is a real challenge from a couple of perspectives. perspectives. It becomes a challenge from the perspective of data redundancy, because my black boxes are your business processes, and your black boxes are my business processes. And it also raises challenges around what I would call data currency. In other words, how current is our data, and reconciliation. And so when one considers moving parts of business processes to open ecosystems or more closed ecosystems, as one might find in more traditional enterprise domains, we reduce a lot of that, and we optimize and move things forward a little bit more. Now, the ideas of moving some processing onto using blockchain-enabled process engines is not to, if anybody in here is from a legacy company that builds BPM engines, it's not to replace you or your revenue pipeline. It's to accentuate that revenue pipeline, and to do things that an internal business process modeling suite cannot do. So in order to support this, what we have done is build an entire business process execution engine completely in smart contract languages. This is built using the Solidity smart contract programming language, which compiles down to a bytecode that can be ran in, at this point, nearly every blockchain client for the open source side, for the public domain side, or for the enterprise side. Nearly everyone at this point will run what's called an Ethereum virtual machine, and Blackstone compiles down to that. The basic idea is to build a high-level API that allows us to ingest what are called BPMN files. And a BPMN file is an industry standard. It's an XML-based standard that allows us to take very structured documents and turn those into process graphs that live within the context of a particular blockchain. And then we have a full-feature business process execution engine, as well as, and then when you put these things together, what do you get? Well, you get something that is easy for IT to deploy and easy for business units to build and prototype use cases without needing to worry about code. When we first started working on this, one of my co-founders at Monax, who's also our chief scientist, he said, wait, a blockchain is basically a state machine. And so you want to take a state machine and put a state machine in it and then put another state machine in it. And we said, yes, basically that's what we want to do. So it's state machines all the way down. The basic idea of what Blackstone offers is you have a chance to graphically define business processes or a flow that you want to have happen. And along that flow, you can say various users or organizations or roles within organizations need to be able to do something. So this is where swim lanes in typical business process modeling come into play. The output of a graphical modeler, and there's a whole range of modeling software that exists that can output to this BPMN standard XML document. That is then sent to a high-level API, which is loads. It extracts the XML documentation and it loads it into a Solidity process graph. And then that process graph is ingested into the execution engine, which starts to operate the business process. Now, when you think about doing business processes on a blockchain, particularly if you come from a world of traditional business process modeling, you might think, well, a lot of the things that a typical business process engine would do, a blockchain can't particularly do. So a good example of that is within traditional domains, you would have activities that would, for example, send an email or update a record in a particular database or present some information in a web service to a particular user, or send a signal to a particular web service or API and get some information. Now, a blockchain is a closed system. It can't do any of those things. So there's actually a relatively confined set of things that you can do in the context of a particular blockchain. Namely, there's 3 things that you can do within a blockchain-based process engine. First, you can ask a user to do something. That's relatively straightforward. Second, you can send a signal to another smart contract that exists within the context of this particular blockchain. And you can say, do some calculation and return back to me directly. For those that are more on the IT side, this is known as synchronous computation. Or what you can do is you can say, dear other smart contract, you are in charge now. When you are finished doing whatever you are supposed to do, tell me, the process engine, that you are finished, and then I will continue on my process flow. And this is known in computational terms as asynchronous computation. And so when you put these 3 types of activities together, you have an ability to build really quite sophisticated use cases in a graphical manner that requires very little to no code. And so I'm going to go through a couple here and what they look like and how they would be used. These are the 2 that I'll show are from a legal domain. Like I said, we're focused on leveraging this process engine to map it to contractual instruments and track obligations that have been agreed to across parties. This would be a simple on-ramp for a rental agreement, where you might have to understand that if a building was before a certain date, that a certain disclosure needs to be signed. So in New York City, for example, every tenant of a building that was built before 1978 needs to sign a lead paint disclosure. And so what this business process does is it says if you're going to rent in a building that was built before 1978, then you need to sign an additional disclosure, and then we can go and actually sign the rental agreement. And so then we can also build conditionals, as I talked about before. We can also build loops without needing to worry about the code side of it. This is a very simple extract of what a different process, meaning the execution process of a rental agreement might look like. And you can see here that we begin the business process, we come down and then go through a looping process that sends a signal to an additional smart contract on the blockchain, which increments a number. We track that payments have been made. It's kind of immaterial from a business process engine how a particular payment transfer actually is happening. That's not the important or interesting bit of what we're trying to show here. And then we loop back around. And at the end, when we have made sufficient payments, this might be a year contract, it might be a 2-year rental agreement, then we go to the end. Now, for 4 years, we've really been in the business, if I had to break down what our business has been over the course of 4 years, it would be to make this technology approachable and easy to use for business users. And so here's, with 4 commands, really 5, you can very easily install and have operational everything that I just showed in terms of the business process engine. If you'd like to learn more about what we have been working on in terms of the legal domain, you can come talk to us. We have a stand out there, or you can go to agreements.network, and we have outlined everything there. Blackstone is fully documented. It's well over 19,000 lines of Solidity code and about 13,000 lines of documentation. All the documentation for the smart contracts is available at docs. docs.agreements.network. Thank you very much.